Hello and welcome to The Professionals. Client listening and client feedback programs are valuable tools for professional services marketers. In many instances, they are the bedrock that supports future marketing and business development activity. They are also two very distinct activities. I am joined today by Claire Rason, a director at Client Talk, a consultancy created to change the conversations professional services firms have with their own clients and about their own clients. We're going to discuss all things client listening and client feedback programs. So Claire, welcome to The Professionals.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Claire, I thought maybe the first question that would be good to ask is just what is the difference between a client feedback and a client listening program, and how do the two sit together?
So I think the clue is in the name, and it's the feedback. So I think with a feedback program, it's about looking backwards, and a client listening program is more about looking forwards. So to answer the question whether they can sit together, yes, I think they absolutely can, because I think there is an element that we need both. But I think that for me, client listening is really key. Because it is about forward looking, it is about thinking about the client and what they want to tell you as a firm, rather than looking back and perhaps thinking about what you might want to find out about how you've done.
With a client listening program, I mean, the last 2 years have made it quite difficult, I suspect, for many firms to have really meaningful client listening programs, and perhaps has made client feedback a little bit easier. What have you seen over the past 2 years with client listening programs?
So I think what the last 2 years have done is they've highlighted actually that looking back, has its uses, but, is limited. I think particularly when the first lockdown hit us, firms quickly realised that information that they got from clients, even a couple of months prior, was no longer relevant. And I think things have been changing constantly over the last 2 years. And it's really shone a light on the importance of making sure that those conversations with clients are continuous, because pain points, opportunities are changing all the time. In terms of how easy it's been to implement or implement client feedback or client listening, what I've noticed is actually there's been a real, it's been easier to get time in with clients. I think initially, right at the beginning, thinking, obviously we're in the UK, thinking about March 2020 when the UK went into lockdown, I think there was a bit of battening down hatches and firefighting and making sure that clients were okay with what was on the desk at the time. But I think as 2020 moved on, there was a real move towards, okay, well, let's take advantage of the fact that we can schedule a Zoom call or a Teams call with our clients and just find out how they're doing. And I think that's something that, pre-pandemic firms weren't doing. And I think that the firms have, and not all firms, but I think the firms that have seized that opportunity to have really in-depth conversations with their clients are the ones that have put themselves in the best position now to move forward.
It's quite interesting, isn't it? I mean, it strikes me that there's a sort of slight shift from very formal programs pre-pandemic to slightly more informal programs, but with a lot more contact. Does that sort of make sense?
Absolutely. And I think, there's always some bias here, and that's certainly my approach to client listening. Is, for me, it's something that has to be continuous. And I think that, whilst there are benefits to having a very structured formal process, what they do is they force a firm to listen at a certain period of time. And as I said, there are reasons why you might want to have that and why that might be something that can accompany a program. But actually thinking about how can we constantly be listening to our clients, how can we be constantly building on the information that we have, is something that, is extremely powerful. And I think in terms of the informality, it's firms struggle with informal feedback and that constant feedback, but it's something that I think has been made easier in a strange way because of the pandemic.
how does a firm, it might be quite helpful to give our viewers and listeners an idea of what an informal program might entail and how it can actually work. I think a lot of people are very familiar with that sort of quite formal, once a year, sit down with a client sort of program. But when it's sort of more ad hoc, more informal, how does it actually look and work?
So the first thought I've got is around this use of the word informal, because I think there is an element of informal feedback that isn't captured, and that's not what I'm talking about now. Perhaps it's something we can come on to later on in this conversation. But in terms of thinking about a program that is more consistent, I think when we think about traditional client listening programs or client feedback programs, perhaps they happened at a certain time. So maybe at the end of a transaction or the end of a piece of litigation or project or whatever it might be, firms would go in and ask their clients, how did we do? That's kind of typical feedback mode. It could be that a firm might decide, okay, well, every March we're going to do an exercise where we will go out and we will interview clients, and then we'll bring that back. We'll think about it, we'll action it, hopefully, and then we'll come round again in 12 months' time. Now, I think that there's absolutely a place for that, and it's something that I do, so something that I do believe in. But it's that gap between perhaps the 12 months if it's an annual program that you've got, or perhaps it's rather than asking a client for feedback at the end of a project, finding out how they are across the life of a project. So checking in at the beginning and finding out, what are your expectations of us? Why is it that you've chosen us? Checking in midway through, how are we doing? And asking that question at a point in time where actually you can do something about it. So I'm not sure informal is the right word. I think consistent is probably the word I use in that context. So, how does it look? How does it feel? It's making sure that it's something that you're building on across the year, rather than, having snapshot moments.
That makes an awful lot of sense. And I suspect that represents quite a cultural shift for many firms. How should a firm how does the marketing and BD team sort of help change that culture within with their colleagues?
So I think the psychology behind all of this is really interesting, and it's something I could go on about for hours. So I'll try and keep my answer short. I think that again, there will always be a spectrum from firms which don't really do any kind of listening or don't really gather any feedback, through to those firms that perhaps do a lot of this already, and it's shifting either those individuals who are kind of the outliers who really don't want their clients to be approached, or perhaps they're happy with you can go and ask them once we've finished the job, but please don't ask in the middle when things are tricky. If we've got other kind of marketeers, business developers listening, what can they do? I suspect they're doing a lot of this already, but thinking about some quick wins. So, what examples have they got where actually listening made a difference, and a positive difference? I think there's an element around feedback of people, getting information from clients around, if they tell us that we're doing something well, then great, and I kind of feel that already. If they tell us that we're doing something badly, that's going to impact on my relationship, it's going to impact on me, as an individual within the firm, so that makes people feel uncomfortable. So it's making sure that you create an environment where people can see that, actually, if we get something that perhaps is a little bit more constructive, we take it as something that is constructive. It's not something that's used to punish. It's not something that's used to kind of hang individuals out to dry. But demonstrating how that can be used in a constructive way, I think, is really helpful too.
I mean, it sounds also to me that actually having a very rigid form program that has to apply to all partners probably is going to get you unstuck. There needs to be some degree of flexibility to reflect the individuals that are involved. I guess also the other interesting point there is actually acting on the information that you're given in these programs, and there is that concern that partners and other fee earners may have. But how should you approach then where action is needed, not necessarily internally, but maybe with the client? How should you approach those discussions with colleagues in a firm?
So again, it's lots of different thoughts going around in my head. And I think with action, there's a difference between actions which are quite individual to the client or that particular client. And then there might be actions which actually kind of talk to themes that are perhaps coming out in the firm and perhaps requires a broader approach. In terms of individual actions, when we're thinking about kind of, specific relationships, I think if you go out and ask for feedback, for want of a better word, I'm conscious of where we started this conversation, but if you go out and listen to your client and you hear, actually we want you to do this better, or actually we want you to do more of that, it doesn't always have to be negative. The reason why a client will share that with you is because they expect it to be acted upon. They want the relationship to get better. So actually starting from that point of view and understanding, well, the client's not told us this because they've told us this because they want us to improve. They want the relationship to work, I think is a nice place to start. And I think that communication between, making sure that the client knows you're acting is really important. I think oftentimes what will happen is firm will gather feedback. They might well act, they might well change their processes, they might well have conversations internally, but that's not communicated back to the client and that loop isn't closed. So I think, again, and it goes back to this consistency point, going back to the client in a month's time and saying, we heard, this is what we've done. Have you noticed a difference? How does it look? How does it feel? Is there more we could be doing? Is really important. And then, similarly for bigger firm actions, it's about, making sure that you're continually listening and closing that loop all the time. So going back to clients and saying, look, we've heard you, this is what we've done. Does it meet with your expectations? Is there more we can be doing?
With them, how do you think, as we come out of the pandemic, sort of client listening and client feedback programs are likely to change and evolve?
So I think, or I hope, that what the last 2 years have taught us is the need to empathise with our clients. And I think, I've mentioned over the course of this conversation, how are our clients feeling, thinking about emotion. I think that the last 2 years have opened up our homes. With a good example of that today, both of us sat in our respective offices, and I think that's been replicated with client firm relationships. So I think that has led to deeper conversations, and I hope that continues, and I hope that those deep conversations are built on. And I think the last years, as I've said, have accelerated the need to listen. So firms have been forced to, almost put to one side of their formal programs and think, okay, well, what do clients want now? And then in 3 months' time, okay, well, what do clients need now? And I hope that consistency is something that's carried forward into the future. And we've mentioned informal feedback, and I kind of discussed it in one sense, but I think there are lots of informal conversations that are had and aren't captured. And I think if we think about the water cooler moments that you have in an office, that has been the topic of many a conversation over the last years, how do you recreate those in a virtual world? Well, I think you have lots of those moments with clients, and hopefully the last 2 years have demonstrated the value of those conversations that we have in a corridor, in a lift, in a taxi, at a client event. And maybe looking forward, the firms that can think about how we capture those moments and put those into the mix will be ones that will really kind of see dividends, I think, in their listening programs.
It sounds like firms should keep up some of the good habits that they've learned over the last 2 years.
Absolutely. And I think, we've been forced to change, and firms have been forced to listen in a way that perhaps they wouldn't have done before. And, with all periods of change, I think it's good to reflect, just to pause and say, okay, well, what have we done over the last 2 years that surprised us, that's really worked for us, and how can we make sure that we don't forget about that when perhaps we all start getting back into the office and meetings start popping into the diary in real life.
Thank you, Claire. That seems like a very good place to draw a close. Keep listening, everybody. Claire, thank you ever so much for joining the professionals.
Thank you very much for having me.